Good morning, I'm Guy Flynn. I am the chair of DLA Piper's Maryland Real Estate Practice, and I'm a BCF trustee. And I'm here to interview Tom Wilcox. So Tom, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, it's great to be here. Thank you for your service to BCF, Guy.
Well, my pleasure. So Tom, you've had a long and successful career in education, including 19 years as head of Concord Academy, before being recruited to BCF. That's an interesting switch from education to philanthropy. What persuaded you to change direction?
Well, I'm not sure that it's totally a change in direction as opposed to an evolution in my own career and my experience with independent education. And I've often characterized it as moving from desegregation to integration to inclusion to racial equity. I was at Riverdale School in New York when they took their first two African American students in my class. One was a fellow named Skipper Powell. His father was Adam Clayton Powell, the well-known congressman from New York, and the other was a fellow who played a little football named Calvin Hill. And so they were early on in their life in that, and it was very interesting for me to experience their experience and to sort of come alive around these topics. And interestingly enough, I attended a high school in Connecticut that nobody had ever heard of called Worcester School. And what made it distinctive was the fact that when I started there in 1960, it was 20% African American, which was unknown in an independent boarding school. So I got to experience integration. And for us, it was our reality. For the rest of the schools in New England, it became the model. They came and interviewed us, and ironically, there was a headline in the College Board magazine that said, "The school that wanted Negroes." It shows you just how far we've come. So it became the model, actually, for something that's now called A Better Chance, that has put tens of thousands of students in independent schools. And I had the privilege of serving many of them over the years. I adore these kids. Then later in my career, I ended up starting an association of boarding schools and then ran public information for all the independent schools in the country in the late 70s. And we recast independent schools not as old money, all white, exclusive, but rather fully diverse and welcoming to all parties, and got wonderful coverage in the national media on some of the progress that had been made and some of the bold goals that were being set. So it started to work toward real integration and maybe even a little bit of inclusion. I served this school, Concord Academy, for 19 years as head, and we went from 3% kids of color to 30% kids of color over that 19-year period, and went from having a voiceless minority to a very big voice among a lot of kids who really, and faculty, who made us change, and all to the good. So we became an inclusive, or more and more inclusive place, really looking at our privilege, looking at all the issues around structural racism. To go from 3% to 30%, you've got to raise a lot of money. The economic realities were that at least at that point, there wasn't that big a pool of full-paying African Americans. We ended up having a lot. By the time we got really integrated, we became the school of choice for the Henry Louis Gates Juniors of this world, where we had his wonderful daughter Maggie and others. So we had to raise a lot of money, and so the fact that we'd done that, I think, put me somewhere where BCF might look for me. And we dealt deeply with race issues, and that was something that BCF was starting to understand needed to happen. So, and we started a program with public and private schools there that we've actually scaled here in Baltimore, that rather than creaming kids from public schools so they could attend independent schools, got them ready to excel in our best public schools, so we get stronger partners in the public sector. So that was sort of a transition to that. I also needed to figure out what I was going to do when I grew up, because I became a head at 33, and it's not something you do for 60 years. So I spent a sabbatical at the Packard Foundation in California, and had a full year while they were figuring out how to get bigger. They were getting bigger because Mr. Packard had just died, and the assets were going from $1 billion to $9 billion. And so they brought a few people in to sort of help them figure out how to do it. And I figured out that as nice as private foundations were, it's more about analytics than it is about actually doing. You're more like a stock picker than you are somebody who's actually an entrepreneur making it happen. And I figured out that community foundations are where things actually happen. And so when the time came to move on from Concord Academy, I heard about BCF. My mother was in her final months, She was from Baltimore. I visited family here, had a lot of Baltimore connections, but I grew up in New York, and that was a conscious decision by my parents to raise us in an integrated environment in New York City and not in what was still very segregated in Baltimore. So it was appealing. So it was something of a natural transition. And Wally Pinkard, the then chair, actually said to me that I wanted to go national with this public school program, public-private program. And he said, well, if you come and consider serving our community foundation, we'll give you some money for something you could start here and scale it. So it was a bit of a transition, and my ongoing sense that private institutions need to serve larger public purpose. And so it felt really natural, and even though I'd never lived here, in many ways I was coming home. I knew a lot of my parents' friends who have since died, but I knew a lot of them. So it just felt right, and happily I explained to the board that we had done a lot of work in this area at Concord Academy on race, equity, inclusion, and I said, I can have an impact on what the staff looks like, but I can't necessarily have an impact on what the board looks like. In fact, I shouldn't. This is your choice. I work with the board. So they said, well, we'll do something about that. And Wally said, we're going to get 5 more African-American trustees as soon as we can. So of the next 7 trustees that were named, 5 were African-American, and the 2 token whites were the president of Johns Hopkins, the president of N.E. Casey Foundation. So we said, if we have to have tokens, they might as well have a decent job, be able to help us in the community.